Okay, so here's a subject I've discussed in a few forums. I'm doing this relatively unscripted because I also in a hurry to get some videos uploaded and get out and get to sleep. But the subject of bioweapon attack, virus-based bioweapon attack in the United States, has been one of conjecture and speculation with a lot of think tank groups, but the reality is it's happened. It has happened. It has run its course. And one of the reasons it was dealt with in a relatively secretive manner, even though the information is all out there, the information is out there and it's readily available, because different factions of the progressive left have their own reasons for wanting to present it a certain way. And in that respect, the AIDS warfare on the population is something that a lot of them know about. They just don't want to tell the truth about, because there's a lot of people with a stake in how they want to tell the story, even though the information's all out there. Now, in the mid to late 1970s, the Cuban government was involved in wars in Africa where they wanted to support communist regimes, specifically in Angola. Now, at that time, they were getting involved. Angola was basically a held colony by one of the European powers, I forget which one. Not particularly relevant to that side of the discussion. We just know that it was an anti-communist European power. The Cuban sent its own military to Angola to assist in the communist uprising, in the communist revolutions there, in addition to other parts of Africa. Now, at that time, there were certain diseases that were getting around that were related to immune deficiency. In fact, John Travolta had become famous for making a movie called The Boy in a Bubble. And there was a question between people who were born with an immune deficiency versus those who had acquired an immune deficiency. And one of the things they knew was that there were immune deficiency diseases that were virus-based, that were in animals, and that there were different ways that a human might be able to catch that, but it generally required a genetic mutation, which viruses do. Viruses mutate in order to survive and spread, and typically some sort of a blood-to-blood contact. They also got under the impression that it required an immune system to be suppressed in order for somebody to catch it. And that's one of the reasons the various disease control outfits were not taking that particular disease as seriously. You pretty much had to catch a mutated form of it out in the middle of nowhere. One of the things that was happening was this was common among sheep and primates and some animals that might fight each other. They might bite when they fight each other to get each other's blood around, that sort of a thing. And a disease would get around that way. The other thing, of course, is that in the wild, some of these animals would be carnivorous or omnivorous, and if one was dying but not quite dead yet, other animals of that might come up, take a bite. The one fights back, but he doesn't fight back very well. There's a little bit of blood-to-blood contact. And it wasn't really clear whether or not carrion would be able to carry that disease for very long. Like, for example, the animal dies of the disease, other animals come to feed on the body, and it wasn't clear whether or not that stuff would survive very well. What they did know was that the disease had eventually begun to spread among a small number of jet-set homosexual flight attendants. And it was also spreading among some Cuban soldiers. Now, the argument was that these Cuban soldiers may have been intentionally infected through some kind of a whorehouse, some kind of a CIA program. These soldiers were infected through this, and that it was an attack by the CIA against the Cubans, and that they would spread this disease, and it would get caught, and it would spread among the Cubans, and it would depopulate them. One of the things about that I personally think makes it where that theory doesn't really hold water very well is that the CIA just has not shown a history of being in the business of germ warfare, of actually committing germ warfare. Beyond the anthrax experiments of World War II that were done by the British, not by the U.S., they just didn't go very far with it. And the reason was everybody figured out they didn't want that genie getting out of the bottle. You can't fully control those things. And one of the things they would tend to pride themselves on is the specificity of something that of being able to target a population. So I disagree with that theory. I personally think that in some instance the disease had spread from animals to people. Now, one of the things they figured out was that the type of sex that the homosexuals, especially in a dominant submissive type relationship, is that's how the disease is getting around. Okay, these guys are butt fucking hard. They bleed when they're doing it. There's a blood exchange. It's something they're into. The other thing is that there was certain tough guy things that was kind of their thing, and it was also very frowned upon in Castro's Cuba. And when somebody was sent to Angola, they were either a kind of a reject from Cuban society, and they were sent to die in a war that was used to dispose of undesirable people, was send them to the war, or they were a much more serious communist, and at that point they went over there as officers or as an elite. One of the things I started recognizing in my research was that the quarantines of the AIDS victims that had come back from Angola, there were disputes over this. One was that it was a disciplinary barracks for homosexual Cuban soldiers who were caught being homosexual in some way, and that they were being punished. It was a punishment barracks, that they were being kept separately from the rest of the Cubans. The thing is, it wasn't clear that they were being put in the Cuban prisons. The other thing is that the Cuban medical professionals were much more honest about portraying this as a medical quarantine and not social repression. One of the other things I noticed was that there was no indication that any of them were officers. Now, generally speaking, whatever the sexual preference would be, it tend to be relatively equally distributed among enlisted and officers. The thing is that among the Cuban elite, most of them actually carried relatively Catholic conservative values, but officially they would say they didn't believe in God. Fidel Castro was in many ways Catholic educated and Catholic guided, and that was one of the reasons why it was anti-homosexual laws were codified in Cuban laws and social values. But the Cuban medical profession was also very liberal, and this is where we got into a conflict among factions in the left. And this factions in the left basically had those who were progressive liberal that were pro-homosexual because they wanted to promote subcultures that they felt were being repressed in some way in normal Western society. They really had no particular interest in protecting those rights for people in the communist societies that they felt had already become successfully communist and socialist. But they also wanted to prove that they had superior medical care for their people, hence they could effectively use their system to deal with medical problems that the Western world would prove incapable of dealing with, such as the spread of AIDS. So they had instituted a quarantine of anybody caught with this. In fact, they had equated homosexuality with AIDS to such an extent that a positive test for AIDS was equal to a positive test for homosexuality. That was instituted by the Cuban army at some point in the 1970s. Now, let's fast forward a little bit to the presidency of Jimmy Carter. Now, Jimmy Carter was a very liberal president by American standards. He'd been elected to become a liberal president by relatively American standards, but he was also largely a Christian moralist. And in that sense, he was a tolerant Christian moralist and was not fully a darling to the indulgent side of the left. what's interesting about this is that Fidel Castro was also not a lover of the indulgent side of the far left. For Fidel Castro to approve of a program that would involve killing homosexuals and using them as a form of suicide bombers against an undesired population even within the United States, I don't think he would really be against it. His country had already been threatened with nuclear weapons. Cubans, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, were trying to encourage the Russians, who were in charge of the nuclear weapons, they were trying to encourage the Russians into launching nuclear weapons. For Fidel Castro to hesitate from using a bioweapon when in fact the U.S. government had tried to assassinate him, they tried to overthrow his government, he was already trying to encourage the Russians to engage in a nuclear exchange with the United States. I just don't see Fidel Castro as seeing the use of a bioweapon virus as off the table. Fidel Castro didn't like homosexuals to use as either unwilling or unwitting suicide troopers in order to tell them that in order to prove their dedication to communist socialism, they might have to die. These people had been in war in Angola. They already understood how that worked. The thing is when he released people from prisons and dumped them on Miami during the Mariel boatlift, he also dumped open the quarantine centers. These were not simply imprisoned homosexuals. These were quarantine centers. He knew what he was releasing. The other thing is they knew that the disease was contagious. They also, in some way, maybe through promotion of homosexual behavior, brainwashing or whatever, or recruiting people who were homosexuals and not giving them a whole lot of choice, they knew that they would engage in promiscuous, unprotected sex as soon as they were released within the United States, which is exactly what happened. There was a very left of center, gay-friendly organization out of San Francisco, which had paid to get 2 busloads of these Cuban soldiers who were infected with AIDS transported from Miami to San Francisco in the course of the Mariel boatlift. When that took place, I was a kid. I was watching the news in Sausalito, California. We got television shows from San Francisco. That's where all the major news was coming from. And I remember Dad saying, "Don't go downtown, the queers are going crazy right now. What's happening?" Well, turn on the news. These busloads of queers had been dropped off. They were being accepted in a big parade and party by the homosexual community, and they said it's like gay orgy in the street. It's crazy. And there was a lot of talk in the talk radio. There's a lot of talk on the news about it. These people are doing it. What was also happening was they had diagnosed, not long after that, they said, well, there's a mental syndrome that goes when somebody was infected with AIDS. They had said that psychologically they become despondent and they want to infect as many other people as possible with AIDS. I would submit that that was part of the mission programming of those AIDS-infected Cuban soldiers who were released from quarantine as part of the Mariel boatlift and then transported to San Francisco. Now, was this an attack against America in general? What if it was? What if it wasn't? What if there was an internal conflict among the communists, with Fidel Castro being the Catholic-minded anti-homosexual who decided to use them as a bioweapon primarily against those of the left that he was ashamed of and hated, and really didn't have a problem doing considerable amount of harm to. The other thing is he felt there wasn't going to be any blowback on mainland Cuba. There never was blowback on Cuba from the spread of AIDS in the West. Okay, there was no blowback against Cuba. Cuba was already quarantined through trade and travel sanctions. So there was never going to be any blowback against Cuba. As far as we know, AIDS never became a problem in North Korea. So he was looking at a weapon that he could launch and not suffer retaliation for. He also knew that those victims would go along with any story that would make it where they are not the vectors of the destruction of so many lives through the spread of a self-mutating virus. But that virus ran its course. Now there's treatments, now they think they're close to a cure, but there's also situations where even among the homosexuals, they would quarantine themselves from these people, use protective measures, and that sort of a thing. But it is my opinion, based on the information that's out there, that the spread of AIDS went with the intentional release of AIDS-infected Cuban homosexual soldiers from quarantine in Cuba in 1980. Even though there's a lot of stuff on Wikipedia about patient 1 being this homosexual flight steward, I don't think that one person was able to infect enough people for that to spread. I think there was an intentional infection, and that there was a mission prerogative among that group that was sent from Cuba, because each one of them would be able to seduce and have sex with and spread the disease to several other people in the course of that. Once that early generation had died off, the spread of the disease among the homosexual communities greatly reduced, because they weren't under any such mission prerogative. They were saying, well, what is this syndrome? Why would somebody want to spread this to more people? Well, that value and that behavior was programmed into those Cuban soldiers. It's not something that would normally go along with anybody who catches any kind of disease, to have a desire to spread it to other people, unless they had been weaponized in some manner and told, this is your weapon, this is how you're going to carry out your mission. You're going to go in some place with this disease, you're going to die anyway, you're going to prove yourself more dedicated to our revolution by doing what you're going to do. If that same platoon or company of Cuban soldiers had been sent to San Francisco fully armed and just started killing everybody in sight, they would not have managed to kill as many people as they did manage to kill with AIDS.